Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, for taking time out of your day and coming to meet us here online with Jason and Matt. I would like to introduce myself first. I am Janie Pierce-Bretcher. I am not on the screen because no one wants to see me. You're here to see Jason and Matt. I'm the marketing manager for Bedford Freeman Worth Publishers for the AP History List. And I have just a few things that I want to go over and explain before I turn this over to Jason and Matt. Before we start, you'll notice that everyone is muted. Well, everyone but us. The panelists are muted. That's for background noise. So a lot of times you don't notice how much background noise there is. So we have you guys muted for that. And we are going to be following up with an email to you guys that'll include a recording as well as the slides. So no need to ask if you'll be able to get those. You definitely can. We also encourage you to ask questions. It might seem like we can't do so much interactivity, but we actually can. If you will select questions in your control panel, Tiff, if you'll advance. You just select questions and you'll be able to write your question in there, and you can select, how you want to send it to us. So if you'll just let us know that and ask questions at any time, we'll be happy to get your questions over to Jason and Matt. And if you go ahead and advance, Tiffany, thank you. If you have any questions following this webinar, or think of anything that you didn't ask, or if we're not able to get to one of your questions, please feel free to email us at hsmarketing@bfwpub.com, and either I or Tiffany Tang, our marketing coordinator for AP History, will be sure to help you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to the stars of our show, Jason, Stacy, and Matt Ellington. Take it away, you guys.
Thanks, Janie. Matt, I see you're first on the list there. You want to introduce yourself?
Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Matt Ellington. I teach at Ayala High School in Chino Hills, California. Been there for the last 20 years teaching APUS history. Taught 5 before that at South El Monte High School. I am an endorsed College Board presenter. Done a bunch of workshops over the last 15, 20 years. An active reader on the exam, and I've had the privilege to work for Bedford before in the past on some of their other products and other textbooks.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Jason Stacy. I teach at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. I'm in the history department there, where I teach history courses and also history pedagogy courses. Before that, I taught at Adlai Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois, where I taught APUS history for 8 years. I'm also a reader and a table leader. I've done quite a bit of work generating questions for ETS, and I've also done some work for Bedford St. Martin on the textbook documenting United States history. Go ahead, Tiffany. So our title for today is New Methods for Building Skills, Thinking and Writing in Period 2, 1607 to 1754. And a number of those skills and methods that we're going to talk about appear in the textbook that Matt and I have been working on for Bedford St. Martin called Fabric of a Nation, A Brief History with Skills and Sources. And this is really a collaborative project. Like a lot of good things, it takes a lot of people to come together. Not only the good folks at Bedford St. Martin, but Matt and I have been at work on this project for about a year now. And also there are 2 collaborators behind the scenes, 2 historians from Rutgers University, Nancy Hewitt, who's an expert of women's history in the 20th century, and Stephen Lawson, who's an expert of civil rights history. So we just wanted to give them a shout out because they are really an important influence on what this textbook eventually became. So we're going to concentrate today on some of the major challenges for APUS history students and some of the ways in which I imagine you're tackling those challenges in your classroom now, and some of our ideas for how to tackle them. We found that students and teachers face 3 major challenges in achieving success in APUS history. First, students have to learn a large body of new information for an exam that is months in the future. This material is voluminous. and the learning objectives and historical developments articulated by the College Board are very broad. So teachers and students also have to determine what exemplars and illustrative examples can be used to represent these historical developments, especially when they write those free response questions. For this reason, students have to learn to connect specific historical information to broad historical developments and trends. That's the first challenge we thought about. The second is that students need to master a new set of reasoning processes and skills that are likely unfamiliar to them. These processes and skills are a way of doing history that students probably don't know, since this is their first AP history course. At least I found that when I taught AP US history, most of my students had not taken an AP history course before, because at Stevenson High School we had open enrollment. And while many of the earlier history courses that they've taken may have stressed memorization or identification, as we all know here, the APUS history test encourages students to think critically, analyze documents for bias and for audience, determine context, make connections, compare, determine causes and effects, and establish continuities and changes, all through an argumentative approach that requires evidence to support those claims. So that for many of them, they've never learned this material before, and they've never thought about these particular skills or reasoning processes as connected to history specifically. And finally, students have to put it all together. They need to demonstrate knowledge of historical information by mastering the reasoning processes and historical thinking skills. And in other words, students must overcome the first two challenges I mentioned and exhibit the kinds of analytical skills that professional historians exhibit when they practice their craft. So Matt's going to talk about the first challenge, some ideas we have for tackling it, and some of the ways we think we do in Fabric of a Nation.
Okay, well, thanks, Jason. I think Jason did a great job of kind of giving us an overview of those three challenges. So circling back to the first challenge, challenge number one that you can see there on your screen, learning a large body of new information for an exam months in the future. I'm sure that most of you share that challenge and that frustration, and that your students also share, and that is, how can we get them ready for so much content? The redesign was supposed to help us do that by specifying the more specific content that students must know. The challenge, of course, is even though College Board in some ways shrunk the volume, they also are asking for more depth. And they're asking for those exemplars like Jason talked about. So we still find ourselves in that difficult situation of how do we get our kids ready for that? So I'd like to suggest, Jason and I would like to suggest three strategies, three different approaches that we think we built into Fabric of a Nation that can help you help your students. The first of those approaches that you can see on your screen is students learn new information when they integrate it into pre-existing knowledge. We know that's true in our own lives, that we learn best when we tie our existing information into something, and we tie, new information into something that we already know. And we've tried to model that in Fabric of a Nation. On the next slide, which we'll see in just a second, you'll see examples of that connection. Secondly, as a strategy, we will encourage you to, let me rephrase that. We believe that students learn new information when it's broken down into easily digestible chunks. I've had the good fortune of being able to pilot some of this material in my own classroom, and already what my students are telling me is, Mr. Ellington, this is helpful because I'm not getting lost. There are small digestible chunks. We call them modules that are much smaller than chapters that allow students to be able to get from start to finish in a sitting and in a setting where oftentimes when they're distracted, they lose focus, but this allows them to stay on task. And then third, students learn new information when they have to apply it through analysis and argumentation. As you'll see, and as my students have already seen in Fabric of a Nation, there's lots and lots of opportunities for them to take the material that they've just read, that you've just talked about, and then to do something with it in terms of application. Okay, so Fabric of a Nation helps students integrate new information into pre-existing knowledge. We'll see that in a second. But going to those other two approaches, Fabric of a Nation connects new material to previously learned material in easily digestible chunks. So each of the time periods, all 9 time periods, are divided into modules. So for example, Unit 4, which is the unit I'm currently teaching, the antebellum era, is divided into 9 modules, Unit 2, as I think divided into 10 or 11 modules, and each of these modules is about 2 to 5 pages long. I've got to tell you, with today's students, it's very helpful to have these small chunks so that students don't get lost and they can follow the kind of narrative flow from start to finish. Is there another bullet on the slide? Yes, thank you. Also, Fabric of a Nation builds its narrative around skills that students will use on the exam. One of the things that Fabric does is it says, look, how can we help students focus on specifically the content, specifically the skills that they need on the exam? So we're going to look at an example from Module 2.1, which are the opening pages in Unit 2, and look at how Fabric of a Nation uses comparison as a focus for helping students understand the narrative. And then once you look at the sample unit that's online, you'll see other examples for the other reasoning processes, such as continuity and change, causation, and contextualization. So here we go. In Module 2.1, our unit starts with European challengers to Spanish America. And starting on page 6 of the module, there's a section called The French Expand into North America. And so here's an example of what we call a digestible chunk, which has connections to previous materials through the reasoning process of comparison. So here we go. This is what we're talking about when we talk about making those connections kind of explicit for students. So the narrative reads, although French rulers shared Spain's Catholic faith, the two nations were rivals, and the defeat of its armada by English naval forces in 1588 weakened Spain enough to provide the rest of Europe with greater access to North America. So in that first sentence, you can see what we've done. We've set the context in comparing what's happening at the beginning of our discussion in Unit 2 about the French to what we discussed in Unit 1 with the Spanish. Then we go on. Once in North America, the French adopted attitudes and policies that differed significantly from those of Spain. This was due in part to their greater interest in trade and conquest. So we've not only done the similarity piece of comparison that students need, but also have taken them through a brief discussion of the differences. But that focus on comparison isn't simply just from Module 2.1 to information in Unit 1. It's also within Unit 2 as well, as we'll see on the next slide. So on that same page, the Dutch expanded, on the same page, there's a section on the Dutch expanded in North America. So now you can see a digestible chunk that connects to the previous material, again through the lens of comparison. Like the French, the Dutch sought North American colonies. So that compares to the material that we just talked about. We're saying that they also have some of the similar motivations. As Spain's shipbuilding center, the Netherlands benefited from the wealth pouring in from Spain's American empire, and an affluent merchant class emerged. But the Dutch also embraced Calvinism, a form of Protestantism, and sought to separate themselves from Catholic Spain. So here again is an example that you can point to with students in terms of how we in the textbook, and how obviously we would hope that they would on their written responses, use a skill of comparison to both identify similarities and differences, and to tie into pre-existing knowledge as well.
So, as you can probably see here, we have incorporated a narrative that is mindful of the historical thinking skills and the reasoning processes that students have to learn for the test itself. Because no teacher has time to be able to teach the historical information, the narrative, and the historical thinking skills and reasoning processes that students have to know separately. It would almost take 2 distinct courses to do each one of those separated out, so that somehow we have to incorporate them so that we're doing both at the same time. So that, as Matt just walked through, in Module 2.1, so this is the second time period, and there's 9 time periods total for the book, 9 chapters, 9 time periods, just like the curriculum framework. In Module 2.1, so the first module of period 2, models the skill, the historical reasoning process of comparison in the narrative itself as the student's first introduction to that reasoning process. And then as students read through that narrative, ideally they're being prepped as they think about this time period for exhibiting that reasoning process themselves. So if you could take it then to the next slide, Tiffany, let's talk about that second challenge where they begin to try to master these new skills. So that a second challenge for students in APUS history is the mastering of a new set of reasoning processes and historical thinking skills that are likely unfamiliar. So as I mentioned earlier, APUS history is often the first AP course or history course that students take. And while many students have already taken a regular history class, perhaps in middle school or in high school, many of those classes have not required that students exhibit the kind of historical reasoning that is an essential part of the APUS history test. A strong APUS history course treats the historical thinking skills and reasoning processes from the framework like tools that become familiar with application, so that students learn to apply these skills in incremental approach where they can build interpretations and arguments step by step. And this requires practice early and often. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we don't have time during the academic year to practice these skills separately from the material that we're trying to teach. So these skills and reasoning processes must be incorporated into the learning process itself. As you teach the history, so you also teach the skills and reasoning processes. So Matt talked about ways in which Fabric of a Nation incorporates the reasoning processes of comparison into the narrative. So let's take a look at how Fabric of a Nation teaches students to apply these reasoning processes themselves in their own analysis of the historical record. So go ahead, and Tiffany, go to the next slide. So we've taken a just-in-time approach to teaching reasoning processes and historical thinking skills in the book. And by this we mean that after a student reads a model of a reasoning process or a historical thinking skill in the narrative, in this case comparison, then they immediately in the module practice it. So in the module that Matt just discussed in period 2, it was module 2.1, students were introduced to the French and Dutch colonies through a narrative that compared them to the Spanish colonies from period 1, the first chapter they read. After students have read about the Spanish and Dutch colonies in period 2, they are introduced to documents that ask them to practice the reasoning process of comparison through primary sources and through thinking historically and writing historically exercises that appear throughout the module. Thinking historically exercises appear within the narrative in the early chapters of the book, and the writing historically exercises appear at the end of each module. So it's within the narrative itself. Students are reading comparison as they learn about the material, in this case with the French and the Dutch and the Spanish. They're also reading primary sources that ask them questions that require them to practice that historical reasoning process. And then finally, at the end of the module, there's a writing exercise to help them with it. So let's take a look at how the book does this with primary sources. So you can just leave it right there for a second, Tiffany. So the first primary source on the left is from period 1. Don't feel you have to read it, and you can just see from the heading it should be a familiar one. It's the well-known letter by Columbus from his 4th voyage in 1503. And in it, he describes Native Americans in terms particular to Spanish interests. For example, he talks about how they have no swords. They don't even know how to use a sword. He mentions that they cut themselves with their Spanish swords. He believes they'll make excellent servants because they are docile, and that they'll prove easy to convert to Catholicism. So that these are, in fact, this tells us more about the Spanish than it actually does about the Native Americans that Columbus encounters. And likewise, in the source on the right from period 2, it's by the French explorer Samuel de Champlain. Even though he's writing in the 3rd person here, it is written by him. And in this excerpt from 1608, he focuses on French merchants who have followed his voyage and seek trade with native peoples in the French colony of Quebec. Now, if we look at the questions for the de Champlain document, I'll go ahead and click the mouse there, Tiffany. And there's the questions. If we look at the questions from the document, they're pretty small here, but I'll describe them to you. Students have to answer specific questions about the de Champlain excerpt So that those first questions, those first three, appear in Module 2.1 under the de Champlain document. And these questions are all based on the identify, describe, and explain prompts in the College Board's curriculum framework. And Matt and I have written these questions for all the primary sources, hundreds of them in this textbook, that are modeled on those prompts from the College Board. Matt, did you want to jump in?
No, I'm just agreeing with the hundreds part.
Okay. So students will have already answered similar questions to those three we have for de Champlain there. They'll have already answered those for Columbus from period 1. Remember, that Columbus document appears in the previous chapter. But then if you look at those two underneath, the first three, students respond to questions for comparison, which ask them to compare the Columbus and the de Champlain documents as a way to compare the Spanish and French motivations for colonization. So remember that students will already have read a narrative that compares the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch settlements in North America. And so they have a model for a comparison of these three European colonizers. And now they're asked to compare two of them by themselves by focusing on two contrasting documents. So we have this step-by-step approach where they've read a comparison between these three colonizers, and now they're going to apply a comparison when looking at two particular documents. And they have to go back to period 1 to find the Columbus document, physically then synthesizing the time periods and giving them the opportunity to see the way some of these skills are going to work, like comparison, like continuity and change over time. They have to navigate through the textbook itself as a way to exemplify the way in which historians apply these particular reasoning processes. Okay, Tiffany, if you can go to the next. Oh, yes. Go ahead and do the next one after that. Thanks. So the first three chapters of Fabric of a Nation also include exercises that we call thinking historically. And these familiarize students with the APUS history reasoning processes and historical thinking skills. So for example, in period 2, as we mentioned, students are introduced to the reasoning process called comparison through an analysis of similarities and differences between the Spanish, French, and Dutch colonies in the narrative. One of the best ways to introduce students to thinking about comparison is to remind them that there is often an implicit causation question within comparison questions, which asks them to think about the causes of similarities and differences. And that's what we do in this thinking historically exercise here. We're asking them not only to compare, but also think of the causes for the similarities or differences. Thinking about the causes of similarities and differences helps students generate evidence to prove their claims, because remember, students will exhibit many of these skills in the form of an argument, where they will have to generate information from the historical record to prove their claims. So in this thinking historically exercise, we ask students to create a graphic organizer to help their comparison. This graphic organizer can include categories for comparison like politics, economics, society and culture, interaction with the environment, or technology, all of which are thematic categories within the curriculum framework. So let's take a look at an example of one of these graphic organizers that uses economics. Go ahead, Tiffany. So here's a sample graphic organizers we provide for students, along with some information to talk them through it, some directions to talk them through it, and help them compare the French, Spanish, and Dutch within the category of economics. You can see that we've modeled for them how to break down this information so that they compare both similarities and differences and consider the causes of those similarities and differences. And you can see in the last column of characteristics, causes of characteristics encourages students to bring specific historical evidence to bear to help them prove their contentions regarding similarities and differences between these three groups and under the category economics. And then each thinking historically exercise also includes a student sample, and these are really models. This is one that I wrote that we've since simplified for the final version of the book, thanks to Matt, who read it and said, Jason, there's no way that that's going to be a sample for students. But this is a version that was originally included in some of our early material that we used as a sample. And so I cut and pasted it here, and I'll read it just to give you an idea of the way in which we've tried to provide examples for the move from a graphic organizer to a paragraph that a student can use as a model. So from that previous graphic organizer on economics, I wrote this sample for students. By the time the French and Dutch began colonization in North America, the Spanish had established the encomienda system of forced labor for Native American communities in Central and South America. This is material from period 1 that they'll have read and read primary sources about and done analytical exercises from period 1. The encomienda system grew out of the Spanish desire to transform native societies and economies into a system beneficial to the Spanish need for native labor and depended upon a relatively large population of occupying Spanish forces, as well as colonists and religious authorities who sought to convert natives to Catholicism. So again, this is material that students will have brought over from period 1, and it is exhibited in short form in that graphic organizer we had them create. The encomienda required that native peoples undertake labor on behalf of the Spanish, which included agriculture and, in some regions, mining for precious metals. The French and the Dutch, on the other hand, established sparsely populated colonies in the early 17th century, at least a generation after the Spanish, and concentrated primarily on establishing trade networks with Native Americans, for example, in furs. And remember, this is a kind of ideal example provided for students, but it's to show the ways in which it moves from the graphic organizer, from the narrative itself, to comparing the primary sources, to the graphic organizer, and now into a sample paragraph. And once we've modeled thinking historically, we then invite the students to practice it for themselves. So you can see here that we direct students to write a 1 to 3 sentence summary that compares and explains the causes of similarities and differences between the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish colonies in North America using 2 of the following categories. So these are politics, society and culture, interactions with the environment, or technology. We've taken economics out of it. Notice that this isn't really a prompt yet, but it's not so far from a traditional APUS history comparison prompt either. So within the space of 1 module, in period 2, students have gone from reading a model of the reasoning process comparison in the narrative to comparing 2 documents, Columbus and de Champlain, as examples of differences between 2 European colonizing nations, to reviewing an example of a graphic organizer and subsequent paragraph that compares the Spanish, Dutch, and French within the category of economics, to writing a paragraph for themselves that practices the same reasoning process. So this will take us to our 3rd challenge, and I think that's you, Matt.
Okay, let me just make my screen a little bit bigger. Give me a second here so I can see it. So challenge number 3 is demonstrating knowledge of new material and competency in new reasoning processes. So like Jason said, this challenge is really tying those other 2 initial challenges together about using a large body of information. And so we've identified kind of 3 different approaches or strategies here to help with this challenge. The first one is that students are often anxious about exhibiting their knowledge and skills in the free response section of the exam. If anything, I think that's becoming more and more of a challenge as there's just general increases in student anxiety that I see in the classroom. I'm sure Jason sees at the college level and that many of us see as well. And so the question, of course, is how do we help students? And of course, one of the strategies that we modeled in Fabric of a Nation and that we think can be really helpful is just like we did with the historical narrative in terms of breaking that into more digestible chunks, also scaffolding the pedagogy, scaffolding the skills. And so what you see in Fabric of a Nation and our approach in those first 3 units or time periods is to slowly ramp up and to spiral our pedagogy so that by the end of the 3rd unit, students have seen examples, they've practiced bits and pieces, and they have finally put it together to the extent that they can now attack some of these free response questions. And then in the next section, 4 to 6, we provide a little bit of what we call advanced pedagogy, and then finally in units 7 to 9, then we let kids just have full reign, and we don't have any more pedagogy. It's like, now you've practiced this repeatedly, we've taken it apart step by step, we've even shown you models, and now you have the opportunity just to practice and implement all the instruction, right? So that takes us to that third bullet there, that one of the ways is not just scaffolding and having those examples, but it's also just the repetition. It's starting early in Unit 1, and it's not assuming that students really come in with AP skills. Some of them do, but with an open enrollment, many of them don't. And so we start with that level playing field, and we then take that approach to build all students up. You can see there on the screen there is a picture of the San Esteban del Rey mission. I won't read the caption to you, but one of the features, for better or maybe even worse in the textbook, is that we have a lot of images. All of the images have robust captions. All of the captions have questions. If you like questions, you will not be disappointed. Our book has lots of questions, which really gives you as the instructor, Jason's laughing because he had to write a lot of those questions, it gives you as the instructor a lot of options in terms of, okay, if, here's a question I can ask just as a quick formative check to see if students really are understanding or paying attention. And it's also a way for students to check themselves, ask themselves that question. Do they really understand the material before moving on? All right, so Tiffany, next slide, please. So, like I was saying, and like Jason and I have both been talking about, it's really practice, practice, practice. We give very specific, very explicit instruction on all of the different types of free response. We start with short answer because it's the most basic, but by Unit 2, we've already gone into long essay questions. We've already done some of the nuts and bolts and DBQs and document analysis, so that by the end of Unit 3, students will have practiced all of those. In fact, skipping to the third bullet really quick, we have what we call a writing historically feature that is at the end of each module. So as I said, there's maybe 8 to 10 modules per unit. So that's 8 to 10 opportunities for students at the end of these modules to put into practice writing a short answer, an LEQ, or a DBQ. At first, it's just components of it, but by the time we're at the end of Unit 3, it's the full-blown LEQ, it's the full-blown DBQ, and it's all different types of the SAQ. It's the standalone SAQ, it's the SAQ with a primary source image, and it's also, of course, the SAQ with those dueling historical sources as well. So by the end of Period 3, students will have practiced all of those. The example that Jason showed you when we was talking about challenge number 2 was actually another feature that we have embedded in the first few units, and that's a thinking historically feature. We phased that out for units 4 through 9 because that's kind of laying the groundwork pedagogically for students and really emphasizing those skills that then are going to be practiced and refined through the writing examples. So throughout the rest of the book in periods 4 to 9, students regularly practice SAQs, LEQs, DBQs. In fact, there will be one per module, so 8 to 10, sometimes 11, depending on the size of the unit. And then, of course, there's review questions at the end of the unit as well. And those review questions will also have each of those types of free response in them. Okay, Tiffany, next slide, please. So Fabric of a Nation gives students direct writing instruction in the writing historically sections. So what we've done here is we've excerpted a sample from page 14 on crafting a thesis statement based on comparison, since comparison was the skill that we highlighted earlier on. So you can see the approach and the language that we use to try to deconstruct this and explain to students in very simple step-by-step form. So we wrote, throughout the APUS history course on the exam, you'll need to write full-length essays in response to specific prompts and specifically in response to an LEQ. And then we remind students that they need to be able to combine their knowledge and their command of different historical reasoning skills in order to do this. And then we have what we think is an appropriate level prompt given for where they are. And so our prompts earlier in the narrative tend to be simpler. and we focus more on a more basic understanding. By this point, we've got a clear comparison prompt, but it's not maybe quite as robust as what you might see on the APUS history exam. So the example here that we're using in Unit 2 is compare French and Spanish colonial relations with American Indians, explaining the reasons for similarities and differences in interaction during the period between 1492 and 1754. So we're even kind of guiding them in the prompt. Remember, comparison is similarities and differences, though we may not see that actual wording on the AP exam. So just like Jason explained with the thinking historically exercises, also with the writing historically exercises, we break it down step by step. And there's a lot of pedagogy in the first 3 units, particularly Unit 2. It's probably our longest unit because we're trying to accomplish so much in terms of helping students with the skills. So that first step, breaking down the prompt, we go into specific details. I won't read all of that to you, but we guide students in terms of how they should break down the prompt, the kinds of questions they should ask themselves. And then the second step, we say, okay, now that you understand the prompt, which is a pretty basic prompt, how can you go about organizing your information so that you can tackle this prompt effectively? This model that we follow with a step 1 of breaking down the prompt and then organizing and then eventually creating the thesis, as we go forward, we'll condense that in later modules and later units, but we will follow that same basic structure and approach throughout the entire textbook for kids so that they can really see a consistent approach to help them deconstruct these questions. I'm sorry, I'm pausing here. My slide got really small and I don't know what I did here. So give me just a second. So in step 2, list and categorize your relevant historical knowledge. We take students through kind of a detailed step-by-step approach and ask them to create a basic graphic organizer. But rather than say, hey, create a graphic organizer, we give them specific ideas. Look, list the Spanish, list the French. Start by brainstorming the characteristics that you know and some evidence to support that. And as Jason mentioned, and as you can see there as well, we don't just tell students to do that. In the early modules, we give them examples. So we show them what it should look like, and later on, we'll start to pull some of those supports and ask students to generate all of that by themselves. So writing historically exercises use a scaffolded approach to help build student proficiency in the targeted skill. So we've excerpted some examples. Actually, we've excerpted an example from page 15. And we've told the students, once you've characterized each nation's interactions, now you can compare them. So we're breaking this down. We're saying, don't even jump to the comparison yet. Let's first identify the characteristics, and now you can compare them. And so you can see we gave students specific ideas of similarities between the French and the Spanish, how they both relied on cooperation from American allies to expand their empires, and then specific differences as well. The Spanish enslaved large numbers of American Indians. They used the encomienda, the mission system. The French established direct rule of the Great Lakes region. Next slide, please. On pages 16 and 17, right, we then model what thesis statements look like. And in this example, we modeled for students both a weaker thesis as well as a stronger thesis. So if you take a look at the weak thesis in the left column in the middle, it's in the separate font there, it says that while both Spanish and French colonized North America and the American Indians there, the Spanish were cruel to the American Indians, whereas the French were generally more accepting of the practice. And then we explain where that falls a little bit short, that while it contains an assertion about the similarities and the differences, it's kind of vague. Students often use those kinds of terms like cruel and accepting, but we push students to be more specific and more precise and more academic, and then we provide them a model of what a stronger thesis can look like and what they should aspire to. So Spanish and French colonies show similarity in their interactions with some Spanish American Indians in that both formed mutually beneficial alliances with some local tribes during the early periods of conquest. However, the extent to which the relationship between colonies from each European nation and American Indians were characterized by enslavement differed, as the French depended primarily on trade with the native people, employed forced labor, and my slide is blurry there, forced laborers,
far less, I think.
Far less, yeah. I don't know what's wrong with my screen than the Spanish, who sought precious metals and agricultural products in the regions they colonized, and therefore forced native peoples to produce these goods for Spanish benefit. Now, we understand that that's a lot for students, but we want to show them what they can and should aspire to. And then we have an explanation of how and why that thesis statement works there. Because it provides a detailed answer, right? It notes that both the Spanish and the French formed early alliances, but then it also establishes the differences as well. And so a lot of the pedagogy in Unit 2 is devoted to showing students those examples, explaining it to them, and then allowing them the time to practice. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is the slide where we just list some of the features of Fabric of a Nation, because there's quite a bit going on in the book that, when integrated together, we think will be very useful to students to overcome these three challenges. So just to recap them very quickly, as we mentioned, we've got a brief narrative here that is an accessible reading level, generally 2 to 5 pages per module, overwhelmingly 10 or under modules per time period, and 9 time periods for the whole book, 9 chapters, which covers the curriculum framework completely. It's a modular organization of topics into digestible chunks. Our plan is generally that each module takes 1 to 2 days to teach, with homework each evening. There's primary sources throughout, with analytical questions woven into the narrative, and the questions attached to the primary sources are based on those identify, describe, and explain prompts that you'll find throughout the framework. And I just want to stress that whereas in most textbooks you often see a section of primary sources or primary sources set off in a separate box, you know, we've been quite conscious that when we're talking about Columbus's 4th voyage, immediately after that section in the narrative, that Columbus document excerpt appears with the questions for students to consider. Or for example, in Module 2.1, when the French first arrive with the Champlain, we then immediately provide that primary source within the narrative itself. There are thinking historically exercises in each module for periods 1 through 3 to introduce students to the reasoning processes and skills, and then there's writing historically exercises to provide students practice with SAQs, LEQs, and DBQs at the end of every module, so that every module in each time period provides a writing historically exercise. During the first 3 time periods, those are scaffolded with a lot of pedagogy to instruct students how to approach those particular kinds of free response questions. For periods 4 through 6, there's still pedagogy, but we scale it back quite a bit. And through 7 and 9, at the end of each module, there are standard SAQ, LEQ, and DBQs, but there is no pedagogy provided for students, but that students then have that practice at the end of each module all the way up until the test time. We've got images throughout. We've got what we're calling robust captions that do more than just describe what's already there. And we've got questions that ideally students need to go back to the narrative itself to be able to answer, so that no longer are they just looking at an image and then have the image explained to them and then have a sort of simple question where they need to only look at the image. But we hope that these questions and these captions integrate the images into the narrative itself, and that they work alongside the narrative, and that students need to exhibit those historical thinking skills to be able to engage those images. We've got AP-style assessments at the end of each of the 9 time periods with multiple choice questions that are stimulus-based, short answer questions, long essay questions, and DBQs, so that at the end of each time period you have a mini AP test that is specific to each of the 9 time periods. There's a wraparound teacher's edition with lots of great ideas for you, and then the whole thing comes with an AP-style test bank so that you can have some questions that students don't have access to that you can use to generate authentic assessments for them.
Hey, Jason, can I jump in here really quick and highlight a couple of things? In terms of that AP-style test bank, just so you know, it is a full-length practice exam for each of the 9 periods, so 55 stimulus-based multiple-choice questions, 4 SAQs, the DBQ, and LEQ. Jason talked about the mini AP-style assessments after each time period. We made sure to make sure that we had the different types of SAQs represented, that we had multiple LEQs, and that we had a DBQ that's also reflective of what students would see on the exam. The other thing I wanted to mention really quick is that first bullet, a brief narrative at an accessible reading level. I teach a very diverse group of students, and it's important to me as a classroom teacher that we manage to maintain the academic integrity and the scholarship of the historical narrative, while at the same time not disenfranchising students who are second language, of which I've got plenty, and who are first-time AP students and maybe not come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Having piloted part of this textbook in my classroom this year, one of the first responses from my students is, Mr. Ellington, this book is easier to read. I get it more. And so if an accessible reading level is important to you, I really do think you should consider Fabric of a Nation. We worked hard on that.
We did. Okay, Tiffany, I think we're ready for the next slide. Thank you for coming. So I think we've got some time for questions. Janie or Tiffany, do you field those questions for us? How should we do it?
Yes. So I've been answering a few questions already having to do with documenting U.S. history, your other book, Jason. So, of course, there were some questions about, is this an update of documenting? Is it, does it replace documenting? And so I'm hoping that I did this right where I shared my answers with everyone, that it's not really an update. It's more like an upgrade, that, now it includes the content and everything is, all folded into one.
And if I could just add to that, Janie, it's not only an upgrade in that it's got a narrative as part of the sources, but it's got much more detailed scaffolding for historical thinking instruction and writing instruction aimed at the exam itself.
Yeah, if I could jump in too and answer that question. The fundamental difference is that documenting is a book of sources with skills based on the first version of the redesign. Our book is a brief narrative textbook that is loaded with documents and skills based on the most current version of the redesign. So Fabric of a Nation is actually a brief textbook, and we did borrow some of the documents and were inspired by some of the great ideas that Jason, his co-author, had for documenting U.S. history. But this is a kind of a different beast, if you will.
Yes, that's a great explanation. Thank you. And I think that it's going to make a lot more sense also when everyone kind of sees it. So I mentioned also that everyone who's attending the webinar live, we're going to send the complete period 2, sample 2. So when you get a good look at that, it's going to make a lot more sense. You're going to be able to see, exactly how everything fits together and how it flows. Let's see. I do have some questions for you guys. So Don Kaplan asked, how many modules, Matt, you cover in a class, like per day? And how much do you have the kids, let's see, he says, I teach 80-minute blocks on alternate days. So how often do you have your kids and how many modules do you cover in a class period?
Well, okay, so I just started piloting, made Xerox copies of Unit 4 last week. So I don't have a good answer, but essentially I'm going to do Unit 4, which I should know because I'm doing it. I'm pretty sure Unit 4 has got 8 modules now that I think about it, and we're going to do that in 4 weeks. I'm giving myself a little bit of extra time just because it's my first time teaching through it and going through it. But I think Jason was right when he said that modules can be done in anywhere between one to 3 days. It depends on what you want to emphasize. And actually, well, no, let me rephrase that. Yeah, modules can be done in about that amount of time. So my goal right now is to try to do about 2 modules in a week. And again, I hesitate to be more kind of authoritative or definitive because it's my first time teaching through it. But what I will say is our modules are not exactly the same as what the College Board has for their unit guides, but it's that same kind of digestible, chunked format, if you will. So the kind of pacing that teachers are using for that would also work for Fabric of a Nation.
Okay, perfect. And remind me, forgive me if you just said this because I'm multitasking, about how many modules are there total? I can't remember.
We think we're averaging, what, 9 or 10 per unit, maybe?
Yeah, there's 4 in period 1 and 4 in period 8 and 9. So those 2 together equal about one time period, one typical time period.
So 80-ish, maybe?
80. Okay, that's what I was thinking, that it was around 80. That's usually what we try to do, so that if you are having to, move along at a really fast pace, that you can do, 1 a day to kind of catch up if you need to. Okay, perfect. So let me ask this other question then as well. Matt, you kind of touched on this, I think. So one instructor says, one of our problems is that very few students have read and used the textbook. How are you ensuring students use it, and how much homework are you assigning per week? And, does Fabric build in diverse perspectives? And I heard you answer that, Matt.
Diverse perspectives, yes. I would think we were intentional in terms of bringing in a diverse set of voices, both in the documents that are embedded as well as in the narrative itself. That's very important to Jason and I. He can speak more to that even than I can. In terms of how we're ensuring, or how I'm trying to ensure students are reading, that's a challenge no matter what book. I will say this with Fabric of a Nation. My students have been positive, and they don't know that I wrote it. So we're piloting it, and they don't know that it's my book, because I want them to be honest. And one of the things that they like about the book is that it is more accessible, it is easier to follow, it is shorter chunks. And so I can and I am scaffolding and saying, look, I want you to read these 3 sections tonight, answer these questions. We're going to talk about them tomorrow, either in your table groups, or sometimes we'll do sharing out. I'm still working on how I'm implementing that in my own classroom, but I am finding that it's easier to assign and hold students responsible for Fabric than the more traditional comprehensive textbook I've been using.
And that's the goal, right? That's the goal of the modules, is to be able to, so it's less intimidating. It's a smaller, chunk of material. All right. Excellent. So another question, and I went ahead and answered yes on this, but I thought that you guys could better explain this. So we do have a focus on primary sources, but you guys do cover the competing historical narratives as well, those secondary sources, right? You include those?
Yeah, we do. We not only include secondary sources that differ with each other, but we very specifically include pedagogy to train students to answer those short answer questions that have 2 competing historians in it, and we walk them through that process in particular. So there's a very strong secondary source framework that talks through students through interpreting secondary sources, comparing competing historians' ideas, and answering those shorter answer questions.
Yeah, and I would just say that we have those writing historically features at the end of each unit. that has one example, and then within the unit we have writing historically at the end of each module, and at probably 2 or 3 times within a unit, it'll be those dueling sources for the SAQ, and then there's another example of it at the end of unit assessment. So in any given unit, kids may see 3 or 4, sometimes 5 different examples and opportunities to practice with those secondary sources.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. Let's see. Are there any additional questions? Andrew, I see your question. Any way to get a sample of a later time period than period 2? Yeah, we talked about this actually, and that's a really good question, and it's something that I want to look into doing for you guys. So, but let me kind of talk to our editors and figure out what's available also, because it needs to be in a, you know, good format for you guys to be able to work with it. This book publishes in January. That's why I'm saying that. And it's October, so I just want to make sure that anything that I show you is in good shape. All right. Oh, people are offering to help pilot. Wonderful. That's great news. Perfect. All right. Any other questions? And feel free to ask like content questions too, if you are wanting to know like how to teach, you know, something, or how, you know, Jason and Matt would approach a particular subject area. Let's see. Olivia says, is there any way to access this session after this live session to rewatch? Yes. Yes. We will be sending it out in a follow-up. So again, we'll send an email as a follow-up with a link to the recording, as well as the PowerPoint or the slide deck that Jason and Matt have used. So you'll have access to that as well. Let's see. Brett asked, how much time do you spend on content versus skills? Ooh, that's a good question.
I don't know, both, right? Because there's definitely content. There's definitely, at least in my own classroom now, direct instruction. But students, as we talked about in Challenge 3 in particular, students need to be able to do something with the content. Otherwise, they're liable to forget it. And so one of the things that's great about Fabric of a Nation, and one of the things that I think a lot of us do in our classrooms, is give kids regular practice. Okay, now that we've talked about it, let's look at these documents. Let's practice writing thesis statements. Let's have a discussion or a debate. And so it's a lot of both. I don't know how I would characterize it exactly in my own classroom, but I would say more days than not, we're doing a blend of both of those, content and skill, because to practice the skill, students need content, but to remember the content, the application of the skill is very helpful.
Exactly. Okay, perfect. All right. Oh, Brent said, very quickly, Brent said, the concern is how deep you get into the content. I think this comes from the fact that, right, the AP exam changed. And it, you know, we talk about this all the time. It moved away from, you know, content to being more skill driven, but you've got to have the content in order to practice the skills. So I think that's where his question is coming from. He says, story gets complicated in most periods.
Wait, say it again. He says what?
He says the story gets really complicated in most periods.
To my mind, those learning objectives and the historical developments allow you to shape the narrative that you're going to tell your students, so that the information that you tell them is largely to support broader trends that you're trying to teach them. And that's, you know, that's how the old-fashioned kind of history course worked as well, and that it was mostly narrative, and it was one person giving a lecture, but they weren't very explicit about using information as a way to exemplify certain trends that they're trying to explain. And so, you know, this new framework is not so different than, I think, a traditional approach, but now both teachers and students, I think, are more mindful that the evidence that they bring in, the depth that they bring in, serves an end to instruct in the broader learning objectives and the developments that you're trying to get them to understand.
Perfect. Okay, the questions have slowed down, and I'm really trying to keep this to an hour, so I want to go ahead and cut this off. But if you think of a question, please respond to the email that you get as a follow-up, or send either Matt or Jason an email. You see their email addresses there on the screen, or you can email us at hsmarketing@bfwpub.com. We're happy to help. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Matt and Jason, for the time you took to do this as well.
Thanks, Janie. Thanks, everyone. Have a good year.
Perfect. Bye, y'all.